experts. One of them, of course, is Mr. Giulio Terzi, the Honorable Giulio Terzi, an expert in international law. The Honorable Terzi has had a distinguished career as a diplomat going back to 1973. Mr. Terzi was the foreign minister of Italy from 2011 to 2013, and before that, he served as Italy's ambassador to the United States from 2009 to 2011. And prior to that, Mr. Terzi was Italy's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. Our other panelist is Dr. Walid Fares, an American political scientist, author, and advisor. He is the co-secretary general of the Transatlantic Parliamentary Group, a transatlantic caucus of members of US Congress and the European Parliament, founded in 2008. Dr. Fares briefs and testifies to US Congress, the European Parliament, and the United Nations Security Council on matters related to international security, democracy, and Middle East conflicts, and he lectures at defense and national security institutions and serves as a consultant on international affairs in the private sector, and we are extremely delighted to have them both joining us. Before I begin, let me also take care of some housekeeping matters. The briefing today is being live streamed on NCRI's Twitter account. It is at Iran_policy, and also on our YouTube, which is NCRI FHC. This is for the English viewers, and for Arabic viewers, it is being live streamed at NCRI Arabic, and on Facebook, NCRI Arabic as well. And with that, I will speak briefly about one of the subjects of our today's briefing, and then I will hand over to our distinguished panelists to make their remarks. In recent years, the international community has grown extremely concerned about the Iranian regime's ballistic missile program, which is one of its strategic military levers. The Revolutionary Guard's Aerospace Force is one of the Guard's 5 forces. Given the rise of the missile program in the regime's military apparatus, in October 2009, the Revolutionary Guards changed the IRGC Air Force into IRGC's Aerospace Force. Today, I will provide details on 2 of the IRGC's most important ballistic missile facilities in Western Iran, which is based on information provided to the NCRI by the People's Mujahedin Organization of Iran, the PMI-MEK. These 2 sites are: 1, the missile site in Kenish Canyon, located northeast of Kermanshah in Western Iran. This is one of the most strategically located IRGC missile facilities, and previously, this site was home to the 9th Battle Brigade, which are the Iraqi proxies of the IRGC. The second site that we will be talking about today is called Panj Pelle Missile Site, located east of the city of Kermanshah, which is the capital of the province of Kermanshah in Western Iran. The IRGC's missile command in Western Iran is located at the Panj Pelle Missile Site, among the IRGC's oldest and most important missile centers. When Qasem Soleimani was eliminated in Iraq on January 3, 2020, Khamenei ordered the IRGC to launch a missile attack on the Ain al-Assad base in Anbar province in Western Iran on January the 8th, 2020. The regime has never said from where those missiles were launched at the American base in Iraq. Based upon information from the MEK sources inside Iran, specifically within the IRGC, the attacks were carried out from these two missile sites. According to recent information, these two sites, in each other's proximity, about 2 to 3 kilometers apart on two sides of a mountain, are connected by underground tunnels. Brigadier General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, commander of the IRGC's Aerospace Force, had personally taken command of the operation and was stationed at the missile site in Panjpelle. But less than half hour after the Ukrainian plane Flight 752 was shot down by the IRGC on January 8th, Hajizadeh quickly returned to Kermanshah Airport to fly back to Tehran. As you can see, these are the tunnels that the regime has dug in the Panjpelle site in Kermanshah province. Now, let me talk a little bit about the Kenish Canyon site in Kermanshah. This site, close to the western borders of the country, provides a strategic spot for housing and launching missiles toward potential targets. It's also perfectly suitable for keeping mobile missile launch platforms and transforming them to desired locations closer to the border. Built many years ago by the engineering firms affiliated to Khatam al-Anbiya garrison, it is used by the Revolutionary Guards and specifically its missile arm. Some of the changes and expansions have occurred in 2020. The Kennish missile site is located in the north of the city of Kermanshah, the capital of Kermanshah province, at the western border of Iran. Various types of IRGC ballistic missiles, namely the Shahab-2 and Shahab-3 families, and Zulfiqar missiles, are housed at this site. The area is surrounded by highlands in the north, east, and south, and therefore the site is well hidden between the mountains. The spot is flanked by a semi-highland area and scattered residential zones on the east side. Two towns with an exclusively military population find themselves in the southwest. They are named Takavar, Farsi for ranger, and Zafar, Farsi for victory. The Kermanshah Airport is located 10 kilometers to the south, and it is closer to the missile launch facility. The exclusive guarded gate of this site is placed on its south side, which leads to the northern parts of the towns of Zafar and Takavar, as you see in this slide. The site includes no less than 5 bases and several sheds well dispersed from each other. At least 5 hatches are understood to be distanced from the tunnels, which are very similar to the IRGC missile shelters and launch pads, like in the video clips broadcast by the state's media. These are 2 entries for which tunnel, and they appear to serve for inserting the missiles into the underground facilities for storage and for keeping them ready for launch throughout the launch pads. One of the bases is located 4 kilometers to north of the site, and since early 2020, the regime has created 2 new tunnels in this location. The only entrance to the site is located in the western part of it, which is north of Zafar and Takavar towns, as you can see in this slide. Now let me talk about the Panchpelle missile site in east of Kermanshah. This site is one of the IRGC's underground missile centers, which has extensive tunnels and facilities in Zirku. This site has been created in an area of approximately 2 by 3 kilometers. The site is located in a mountainous area north of the highway to Kermanshah Airport. It is actually at kilometer 5 of Kermanshah Highway to Hamadan, north of the road, and is inside the mountain. IRGC's Mujahedin garrison is located on the south side of the road in front of this site. The regular Army's aviation base is also located near this place. In the map and the aerial photo, the location of this site and the entrance of the tunnels under the mountain in the north of the site can clearly be seen. Let me conclude by saying that for the mullah's regime, the ballistic missile program is a strategic lever of survival. And for this reason, the project has continued uninterruptedly at the cost of billions of dollars over the past 3 decades. Missile programs, nuclear weapons, and meddling in regional countries are part and parcel of a single policy, which is the flip side of the brutal internal repression and obviously against the highest interests of the Iranian people. On July 14, 2015, a few hours after the P5+1 signed the so-called Iran nuclear deal with Iran, the NCRI's president-elect, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, said that Western countries must insist that the Iranian regime must not interfere in the Middle East, and in fact, it must be expelled from the region. And she also emphasized that the issue of Iran's ballistic missile program must be included in any agreement with the regime. Unfortunately, of course, we have seen that Western countries have turned a blind eye to the regime's destructive behavior, an approach whose devastating impact and effects we have already seen so far. There's no question that as we speak, the regime is at a deadly impasse, and it is by continuing to foment crises, including the use of ballistic missiles, it wants to cover up its irremediable crisis and break the suffocating siege in which it finds itself. The ultimate solution from our point of view is regime change by the Iranian people and the Iranian resistance. Nevertheless, the mullahs are counting on Western inaction vis-a-vis their aggression. It is incredibly naive from our point of view to assume that giving concessions or ignoring the regime's violations will change its behavior. That has not happened so far and is very unlikely to happen in the future. In fact, the regime will not change and it will continue to produce and launch ballistic missiles. As such, we think it is high time for the international community, for the United States, and for the European Union to hold the regime accountable for its malign activities, its destabilizing actions in the Middle East, its human rights abuses, and of course, and most specifically here today, hold it to account for its ballistic missile program. And with that, I now give the floor to Foreign Minister Terzi. Foreign Minister, please, we're anxious to hear your remarks.
Oh,
I think you are muted, Foreign Minister.
no, it's okay now, I believe. Should be okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your introductory words and for your presentation, Dr. Isafavi. Extremely interesting, and it goes without saying that I agree with your judgment and your encouragement to the international community, especially to the European Union, to take a completely different course from the course which has been taken until now, and this course is to have a completely different policy vis-a-vis the Iranian regime across the board and on each single issue, but especially on the issue of the nuclear threat and the ballistic threat, which is increasing the more we follow, the more the international community is following this nonsense policy of appeasement. So let me say that while Iran's ballistic missile program goes almost as back as the 1980s, I will focus on the Iranian regime's activities in the past 5 years, namely since the implementation of the JCPOA, which is the pressing issue, the most pressing issue on both sides of the Atlantic, both for the new American administration and for the relation between...
Forgive me, Foreign Minister, could you raise your volume, please? We cannot hear you very well.
Yes, is it better now?
Is it possible to go higher?
I think it is the highest that I can. Let me see whether no is on my computer is both the top mark in unless I try to unplug my ear.
And I speak like this is better.
This is excellent.
Do you hear me?
This is better. Go ahead.
Is it better now? Is it better like this?
Yes.
Fantastic. So let me go again on this, and thanking you very much for your presentation and the basic elements that you have addressed to the international community, especially to the American administration, to the European Union, in the sense that this appeasement policy is completely wrong and ill-designed. It is a very different track that we have to engage in. It's a different track, and I'll try to say in my short words on this occasion, being open also to question and answers in the aftermath. I would like to start by saying that while Iran's ballistic missile program goes almost as back as the 80s, it is evident that the Iranian regime's activities during the past 5 years, since the implementation of JCPOA, have not demonstrated at all that the nuclear agreement has been a successful experience. On the contrary, and that is because it's such the JCPOA and the ballistic missile program is such a critical issue on both sides of the Atlantic. We have to remember that in the preface to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the P5+1 stressed that the signatories, and I quote, anticipate that full implementation of this JCPOA will positively contribute to regional and international peace and security. Resolution 2231 of the UN Security Council was based on the JCPOA, as specifically calling for Iran to refrain from activities related to nuclear-capable missiles. But almost immediately after implementation of the JCPOA, of the adoption and entering into force of the JCPOA, Tehran started immediately violating the spirit of that joint program of action, not an agreement, not a treaty as we know in formal terms, but still a legally binding intent. And they started violating the norm and the spirit, but especially the spirit, expanding the production, the test, and the exportation, even the exportation of its missiles. And that happened as the proponents of the JCPOA should be reminded that on March 29th, 2016, just a little less than 1 year after adoption, After 3 months of the implementation of the nuclear agreement, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany wrote a joint letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations explicitly accusing Iran of defying Security Council Resolution 2231, and they accused Iran, the 5+1, they accused the 4 Western countries of the 5+1, they accused Iran of defying the resolution 2231 because they had conducted, it was very evident that they were conducting missile tests which were not in line, not acceptable, taking into account this resolution, not acceptable both in legal terms and also especially in the spirit of that resolution. And in fact, a European leader who has been constantly in favor of the agreement had to declare and to admit to the Bundestag on July the 7th, Chancellor Angela Merkel, on July the 7th, 2016, she said to the Bundestag, and I quote, that Iran continued unabated to develop its rocket program in conflict with the relevant provisions of the UN Security Council. End of quote. The Middle East and North Africa subcommittee of the US House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee in the United States held a hearing on March 31st, 2017, titled, and I quote, Testing the Limits, Iran's Ballistic Missile Program, Sanctions to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In that hearing, the chair of the subcommittee said, and I quote again, since the signing of the JCPOA, Iran has tested at least 15 ballistic missiles, and has done so in open defiance of Resolution 2231. In fact, the Iranian regime had tested a rocket that can deliver satellites into the orbit, and that it did so on July 27, 2017, following a test of the Simorgh, which means Phoenix, as you know. And following that test, again, the 4 countries of the 5+1, that is to say US, France, Germany, and Britain, issued their joint statement condemning the action of testing that rocket, the action, and expressing their concern that this test had a destabilizing impact in the region. And I can go on and on because there have been a number of violations and examples and evidences that Iran is violating not only with this missile test, which are extremely worrisome for the international community, but it kept pushing, obtaining illicit and smuggled equipment and parts of equipment needed for manufacturing missiles and weapons of mass destruction. And I do say that they continue to obtain this equipment from different sources. One can identify and reconnect to the old cooperation that the Iranian regime has with North Korea. But very unfortunately, they were able also to obtain from private companies technologies and spare parts and components, also from Western countries which have been induced in violations on illicit trade with the regime. To the point that the German intelligence report, which followed the nuclear agreement in 2015, a certain point said, and I quote again, there's been little or no decrease in the Islamic Republic's efforts to gain technology for missile capable of carrying warheads. That means nuclear warheads. And actually, the Ayatollahs kept expanding their ballistic missile program unabated and with no impunity, particularly from the EU countries throughout the last 5 years. And again, and you mentioned, Dr. Safavi, the different statement by the President-elect Mariam Rajavi on this matter that are really extremely important statements, because they can be summarized in a press conference undertaken on June 20th, 2017 by the representative of NCRI, a press conference, that one, which exposed 42 centers for missile production, development, and testing by the IRGC throughout the country. So the IRGC is moving as a huge machinery which matches economic activities with high tech and weaponizing of armaments and the nuclear process, as we know very well, because many centers belong to the IRGC, and that is also a reason why the international community should be much more forthcoming, especially the European and Western countries in general, in labeling as a terrorist entity the IRGC. The problem was aggravated over the years. I mean, is another thing which must be underlined, because Tehran not only did follow a strategy of arming itself and providing this huge arsenal of missiles and the dual capacity, even more recently, dual capacity missiles to its to its army, but also because Tehran has become a major provider of missiles and missile technology throughout the region and to its proxies. And has been so huge, this phenomenon, that many terrorist entities and bad actors, including the Houthis in Yemen, we know the continuous attack that the Houthis have been addressed to neighboring countries, especially Saudi Arabia, but Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, its proxies, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. All these entities which are at war with the country, which are carrying on a sectarian war in the name of the mullahs, is spreading a situation of war with different intensities throughout the country. And this trend reached a turning point in 2019 when Iran targeted Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, and with the September 2019 attack on Saudi oil facilities, which was condemned by the UN Secretary General Guterres, but again, to no avail, because there was not an end to these nefarious activities by the Iranians. So let me say that there should be no illusion on what is going on. The Iranian regime has set and established a policy of continuing to manufacture, expand, export, and even use ballistic missiles and work to increase their range. These weapons are becoming more lethal, precise, accurate, and dangerous. And they're becoming a threat in an increased way by the day. There is a trend which is continuing, has never been deterred sufficiently up to now. And in light of the above, it is simply naive and dangerous to re-enter. I mean, it's astonishing how there are still voices. Unfortunately, the American voice in this very moment, I would say there were many doubts and many concerns about the line that President Biden and Secretary Blinken and the top level of the administration would have undertaken vis-a-vis Iran. They appear to be more cautious than many people were suggesting, and especially more cautious than Foreign Minister Javad Zarif and the Iranian leadership did appear to believe. But we have to emphasize, I mean, all people who are concerned by the Iranian threat they cannot be shy in continuing emphasizing that is simply naive and dangerous to re-enter the JCPOA without realizing that it was a flawed deal. A flawed deal because it didn't produce. On the contrary, over the last 5 years, it got and produced exactly the opposite effect to what should have been expected by the international community. Did not provide that agreement any restraint to the Iranian regime malicious activities. And it is more dangerous, especially for the European, to ignore that this threat is another threat to the stability, to the overall stability of the Middle East. And therefore, again, dear friends, it is a total failure what the experience of these last 5 years of implementation. I'll say implementation between brackets on quotes as you want, because it was not implemented at all, especially by the Iranians who have taken these 5 years just to increase the capacity of the centrifuges, to increase the stockpile of enriched uranium, and so on and so on. So in conclusion, what is the suggestion that I believe should be put forward and should be really stressed? First of all, zero enrichment or reprocessing in the hands of an Iranian regime like this one must be completely forbidden. Zero enrichment or reprocessing, because the JCPOA represented the departure from the previous international demand of zero uranium enrichment or uranium reprocessing. That was really a dogma for people, for the negotiators of non-proliferation agreement, and there was a breach in that norm 5 years ago when Iran was allowed, this regime in Iran was allowed to start a path of enrichment and reprocessing. Second, Iran's unacceptable behavior beyond the nuclear proliferation and missile proliferation, beyond those big breaches to the international law, Iran behavior must be addressed in any new agreement. The regional issues must be a core component of any new understanding on non-proliferation, both on the side of nuclear or missile proliferation. And third, Iran's missile program is support for terrorist proxies and partners operating in Middle East and in a wider sense, also in Europe, because we know that terrorist activity by MOIS, IRGC, the Iranian intelligence in Europe is trying to make major terrorist attack. I mean, the Iran's missile program must be looked with a lot of care and attention, also in the sense that it can support terrorist and malicious activities of Iran around the world. And fourth, it is the limited willingness of the international community to hold the regime accountable for all its abuses must completely change. There must be a big emphasis on the priority that the Iranian threat is addressed to not only to neighbors, but also globally. This limited willingness by the international community, and especially by the Europeans, must give ground to a determined political will to be firm and consistent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency Terzi, for that very insightful and enlightening presentation. I think you laid out a very, very clear picture of the dangers that the Iranian regime poses, not only to its own people, to the people of region, but also internationally and in Europe, from your perspective, being a European. And the failure of the attempts to negotiate some sort of an agreement with the regime to prevent it from undertaking such dangerous actions, whether it is its missile program, its nuclear program, or as you said, its support for terrorism and arming and financing and training its proxies in the region. And indeed, as you said, the time has come to take decisive action against all of these issues. And the failure to do so, I think, first and foremost, will be detrimental to the security and safety of not only the Iranian people, the people in the region, but Europe itself. And with that, I now turn over the mic to Dr. Fares. Dr. Fares, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Savavi. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Dr. Ali, thank you very much for the invitation. Honored to have been also with Minister Terzi on the same panel. We are now in Washington and of course in Brussels, other capitals in the region, living the moment of what we think is a return to the Iran deal. That's what the administration is trying to organize out of Washington and their partners in Europe. However, as the panel has already shown, there is a problem in a simple return to the Iran deal. And that problem is that over the past 5 years, the Iran regime displayed and continue to display a behavior that would endanger, actually, first of all, Iran and its people, the region in the Middle East, Europe and the United States, and the international community. So the discussion, or the points I would like to raise, are centered on the road back to any Iran deal. Obviously, those among us who are going to be focusing on Iran behavior. And Iran behavior has 3 quick points, 2 of which have been already covered. One is, what is Iran nuclear intentions really? 2, the issue of ballistic missiles, which is becoming now, even with the strongest supporters of the Iran deal, a major matter because of the threat. And the 3rd point, which I would like to summarize to you today, is the ballistic behavior of Iran. You have ballistic missiles, but then you have ballistic behavior. Not to repeat what has been said, but looking outside Iran in the region, in the Middle East, there are 4 countries where the Iranian regime is operating. These are battlegrounds. So any return to the Iran deal cannot just go back to Tehran and deal with a technical matter of counting the points that the Iranian regime is doing or not doing. It has completely changed. We're talking about the geopolitics of the whole region. Yemen, Houthi militias, who have controlled a large segment of a country, of a sovereign country, who are in a battlefield armed by the Iranian regime, including by missiles, who are in an effective war with the legitimate government of Yemen, with the Arab coalition that includes obviously Saudi Arabia and Emirates and Bahrain and dozens of other countries. And also what is very perturbing in Yemen is that those Houthi militias, in addition to their war waged on the region, have had a record of abuse of human rights that is terrible. There is not one single human rights organization around the world that has not said that there is a major problem in the behavior of those allies of the Iranian regime. The last of which was last week, when dozens of African migrants, we're not talking just about casualties in a war, African migrants were killed by the Houthi militias. Iraq. Iran has technically, with its militias, established control over the country of Iraq, with some exceptions. It has been able to penetrate the country with its own militias through Hashd al-Shabi, Kata'ib Hezbollah, and many other organizations. But those militias are not only controlling government and the economy and the banks, and they are actually engaged, as is the case in Yemen, in suppressing the population of Iraq. We all remember from TV and news during the fall of 2019, how hundreds of thousands of young Iraqis from all communities, Arab Sunni, Arab Shia, Kurds, Christians, took to the streets of Iraq demanding reforms. They were met by lethal force. More than 700 Iraqi citizens of all communities have been killed by the Iranian militias. So you see, we are so far from just discussing what's happening in those nuclear sites in Iran. We're talking about other countries suffering the Iranian regime brutality. Syria, civil war since 2011. One segment of that civil war, one camp of that civil war, which is the Assad regime, is fully backed by the Iran regime. Not only this, but the Iranian forces that are present in Syria have invited militias, so-called pro-Iranian Shia militias, from as far as Afghanistan and even beyond in Asia, and of course in Iraq and in Lebanon, to fight a war in Syria, which by now, I think the numbers tell us more than 700,000 people have been killed. 5 million Syrians have been moved out of their country or within their own country. Thirdly, or fourthly, we have the issue of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is not shy about it. They say, we are the allies of the Iranian regime. Its Secretary General says, I am part of the regional web and leadership of the Iranian regime. He's not shy about it. So what we are dealing with now is an Iranian regime quasi-occupation of 4 Arab countries, bringing into those 4 Arab countries either direct Iranian militias, the Pasdaran, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, in 4 other countries, or bring in supports including military and missiles and others. So let me summarize this one important point. There cannot be a return to an Iran deal, quote unquote, without resolving this Khomeinist imperialism that is occupying half of the Middle East. Now, in terms of what should be done by the international community, we know that some of the countries, to be honest and clear about it, who have already engaged Iran's regime in economic interests. Is this a secret? It is not. Many European countries, Asian countries have done business with the Iranian regime. They want to continue and they want to go back. Even here in the United States, though, the previous administration withdrew from the Iran deal, many interests are pressing the Biden administration, pressing it with all the strength they have to return quickly to the Iran deal. They don't care about the geopolitics of it. They want to go back and do business. We have nothing against interest doing business between countries. That's the nature of our system, and we encourage that. But the price of going back to the Iran deal fast, without even looking at everything we have covered here, from human rights abuses in 4 countries and in Iran, which I have not even touched, the deployment of missiles, ballistic missiles in the region, the presence of Iranian-controlled or Iranian units in very sensitive places. Bab el-Mandeb controls the passage of world economy, threats in the Gulf, attacks against Saudi Arabia, all of that, and I summarize my point before I look at what should be done in my view, indicates that the path to an Iran deal has now to be internationalized, has now to take into consideration the security of the Middle East as a whole. So here's what I would suggest as a point we could and should discuss. Number one, the Iran regime behavior should be at the top of the list in international negotiations for a potential new Iran deal, meaning deal about the security of Iran and the Middle East. And there are 2 points that are extremely important, which have been covered, which are the missiles deployment, point A, missiles deployment. Now, as it has been covered by the panel, we have seen missiles being fired by the Houthis into Saudi Arabia and by Iran into Saudi Arabia. We've seen terrorist activities along the shores of the UAE. We've seen Iran-backed militias in Iraq firing missiles against US and coalition forces. We've seen also Iran deploying these missiles in Syria, aiming at Israel. We know and we've seen Hezbollah And they have claimed it, that they have thousands and thousands of these missiles. So if you ask me, I would say, point number one, missiles. The international community must ensure that those missiles are removed from these countries because they have been deployed by a foreign force in these countries. That's to begin with. Second, you have the participation in the process. Who should be engaged in renegotiating a new Iran deal? We are with a new Iran deal. Everybody is. But who should be there? Well, in addition to the United States, obviously, the European and other partners of the JCPOA, those most interested and affected are the neighbors of Iran. We're talking about the Arab neighbors of Iran. I mean, missiles have been fired against Saudi Arabia live on TV. So can we imagine that Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Bahrain and Kuwait and other countries and Oman are not part of this negotiation? They should be part of that negotiation, of that round table. Second, obviously, Israel should be part of that renegotiation. If every single day from the Houthis of Yemen to the Pasdaran of Iran, they scream and chant death to America and death to Israel, it would be the most logical step that Israel will also be part of these negotiations. C, and last point, for the first time, I believe, the international community should begin engaging with the Iranian opposition. Now, why would the Iranian opposition be engaged? Because we've seen live on TV as well, for at least 3 months, inside Iran, hundreds of thousands of Iranian citizens of all ethnic communities and religious backgrounds demonstrating and protesting the behavior of the Iran regime. There is another Iran inside Iran that we need to engage. That's exactly what US policy is trying to do in Yemen. Washington is trying to engage the Houthis and engage the legal government, the legitimate government of Yemen. That's what we are doing everywhere. We're talking to the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan, though the roles are inverse there. It is only logical and natural that as we are trying as international community to resolve the threat coming from that regime, to engage with the Iranian opposition and resistance, to have their voices also being heard at that table of negotiation. So I think that, and this is my call on the Biden administration, but also on the US opposition, which is in Congress, in the Senate and the House. We have democracy, we have an administration, and we have an opposition, and we need to be, mindful of this, as well as is the case worldwide, that we need to be united as Americans, as international community, in making sure that the actual strategic threat of the Iranian regime is dealt with. That should be done through political negotiations, and we need to make sure that all the items on the table of negotiations or talks should be reviewed, starting with the missiles, but also the militias. And thirdly, to have all those who have stakes in these negotiations, including Arab neighbors, Israel, and Iran opposition, being part of that new table of negotiations. And thank you very much for giving me that opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fares, for an excellent remarks and presentation. It was really very, very precise and got to the heart of the issue. And let me just segue from your last point, the third point. You raised the Iranian opposition, and you also mentioned the massive demonstrations and the uprising to which we have been witness, particularly the massive demonstrations in more than 160 cities in Iran in December of 2017 and also 2016. And also we had the uprising in November of 2019, which engulfed 200 Iranian cities, and also in January, which goes to show ironically that the very destabilizing activities that you and the Excellency Foreign Minister Terzi outlined basically is not an indication of the Iranian regime's power, but a reflection of its vulnerability and fragility at home, with a collapsed economy, with runaway inflation, unemployment, with massive endemic corruption and its management. Case in point, the COVID-19 catastrophe, which has led to more than 230,000 Iranians dead. I think the role of the Iranian opposition, the democratic opposition, the National Council of Resistance becomes very, very important, especially since I must say that basically all of the revelations, not only about Iran's nuclear weapons program, but also the missile program, have been basically undertaken by the NCRI and its network, the network of the MEK inside Iran. And you're absolutely correct that any future policy vis-a-vis Iran has to take into account the role of the Iranian opposition. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. We have a question from Eurotimes, Mr. Ali Jabari, who has asked a question about information on the mechanism of giving weapons to the Houthis that targeted Saudi Arabia and also attacking Saudi Arabia from Iraq with Iranian weapons. What do you have to say about that? I guess the speakers before me, Dr. Fares and Foreign Minister Terzi, addressed that. And as Dr. Fares said, of course, all of the drones and missiles that were targeting Saudi Arabia have been provided by the Iranian regime, both the missiles and the technology. And of course, we all know that the attack on Aramco was carried out from Iran itself. So there's no question that the regime in Tehran is a source of tension and chaos in the Middle East region. I'm just waiting for other questions. Are there any other questions from the journalists? There's a question from Al-Ain News. It says that Iran revealed an underground missile city a few days ago. Do you think it represents a threat or is it just a propaganda? Dr. Fares, do you want to take that question perhaps?
Well, it's both, in my view. Experts who are focusing on this will tell us more, but the missile strategy of the Iranian regime is very complex. I actually wrote about it for the first time in 2006 in an article, counterterrorism blog, titled "It's the Missiles, Stupid." It's taken from a slogan at the time, "It's the economy," meaning Iran's regime is basically negotiating on the nuclear, in my view, and taking its time to develop what I call a dome of protection of the Iranian regime, which are the missiles. So Iran's regime is also, we need to note this, developing an anti-aircraft long-range missile system to protect its coming or forthcoming strategic weaponry system, which could be nuclear, but also other than nuclear, from being hit by allies, by the United States or others. Now, the missiles they have developed are in various ranges. The battlefield that showed us exactly how would Iran behave with other countries and governments is what the Houthis are doing in Saudi Arabia. It's a combination between long-range missiles, ballistic, and drones. And unfortunately, Saudi Arabia is sandwiched now between three areas of launch. The most active one is in Yemen, but there is another one in southern Iraq where Iranian-controlled militias can and have most likely used those areas to target Saudi Arabia. And as you have demonstrated very clearly in your presentation, Dr. Ali, Iran territory itself, what you have showed us is very impressive. It shows that there is a strategic intention by the Iranian regime to build these bases for ICBMs. And as I always said on campuses lectures, you don't have ballistic missiles to deliver flowers. You have ballistic missiles to deliver non-conventional weaponry.
Thank you very much for that excellent answer. We have another question from Mr. Nazar Jav from the very important Kuwaiti daily As-Siyasa. Maybe Ambassador Terzi could, Foreign Minister Terzi could address this question. It says, can the Iranian regime's missile program be curbed, which has doubled in danger after supplying their arms with them? And what is the expected, what do you think should be the expected international role in this regard? Foreign Minister Terzi?
Thank you very much, Dr. Safavi. Do you hear me now? Can I speak like this? Is it okay, my micro?
Please, yes, it's very good. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for this question, but I would like also to connect to what was just very comprehensively explained by Dr. Walid Fares, and also referring to this question, to the question that you have posed. There is no doubt that Iran is very efficient in building up a full range capacity of attacking neighbors or threatening neighbors or other countries, very efficient in the missile program. And I agree with Dr. Fares when he says that, yes, all the emphasis was on the nuclear program, the nuclear deal, and the international community did overlook the missile program. In fact, it did overlook the missile program to the point that resolution 2231 was changed nature. It was not at a certain point after the renovation of the resolution, reapproval of a new resolution, it was somehow watered down. It's not a precise and compelling indication with sanction regime and so on, verification, proper verification and so on, but is a sort of just a couple of words changed the real strength of the previous text and the previous norm. So that is the way the Iranians have been able to make progress, both on political and legal terms, and especially on the ground, developing their system. But I'm saying, is a country, the regime is a paradox, a paradox in itself, a sort of a Kafkian situation, because they are very efficient and productive in all which is evil, developing weapons, cyber weapons, missiles, proxies, criminals activities, financing the regime through criminal activities, also connection with with the Latin American drug smugglers and so on, like the Venezuelan generals. So they are very efficient in all that area of international cooperation, and they are a disaster. They are a failed state when it comes to the progress and development of their own people, their society, their economy, their fight against coronavirus. They're trying to and not mentioning, I mean, the question of a minimum existence of civil liberties and so on. So it is a system which is really a specialist in doing evil things. But talking about the missile, yes, it is true. But I believe that this program, missile program, has to be looked also in connection to other elements which have become very evident, even more evident over the last couple of years, perhaps, or even during the last year. The cyber capacity, cyber warfare, cyber information warfare by the Iranian regime. They are joining the propaganda of the anti-Western big powers, which are China and Russia, and it's not a chance that is not is surely a trend which makes sense in connection to the things that I just said, that they are working with these two major major spoilers of the international law to try to obtain technologies, support, advice. Think about the cyber disinformation, the cyber information warfare. What is the help that the Chinese are providing to the Iranians and even the Russians? And that matches, this is for attacking also, not only for political reasons, but also the infrastructure for stealing intellectual properties, stealing technologies from Western countries. So the missile program has been overlooked, but also this cyber capacity by the Iranian has been overlooked. And therefore, now we are in a situation where it is an higher stake to jump over, to contain this country. And there is a very urgent need of coalescing together and to elaborate a common strategy which can only be developed among like-minded countries in the Arab world and in the neighborhood, but especially between the United States and the European Union.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister Terzi, for that response. I guess if I would follow up to what you just said before I go to the next question, which we have, I would say that at the end of the day, the ultimate solution, not only to the threat posed by the Iranian regime's missile program, but also its export of terrorism as referred to by Dr. Fares, and also its nuclear weapons program, is the policy should be focused on regime change, but of course by the Iranian people and the democratic opposition, because I think the history of the past 42 years has demonstrated that all of the efforts aimed at convincing the Iranian regime to behave like a normal state has utterly failed, whether it was through giving it incentives, carrots if they say, or whether by imposing restrictions on it. I guess like we saw even the maximum pressure policy pursued by the previous administration, while of course was impactful, we see Iran more belligerent than ever before. And this is precisely because of what you said, Foreign Minister Terzi, that the regime in Iran is a failed state. And the only way for it to survive, because it is really a regime that does not belong to the 21st century with the medieval ideas that it promotes, but it needs to do that in order to survive a while longer, and which is why I think, as Dr. Fares mentioned, the United States and the European Union, the European countries must open an official channel of the communication with the Iranian opposition, democratic opposition, to bring about the desired change. Mr. Andrew Lawton, true north of Canada, has asked a question. He says in December, Hassan Rouhani said Iran's ballistic missile program is non-negotiable if the JCPOA is to be reevaluated. I know that the NCRI has said that in the past that Iran needs the sanctions lifted. Would they ever budge on the ballistic missile program if they need the money as much as they do? Perhaps Dr. Fares, you want to tackle this question?
That's a very difficult question because it's a smart question and it has to do with understanding the strategic mind of the Iranian regime, which you do very well. The Iranian regime has a dilemma, and they count on divisions in the West to survive that dilemma. So the first component of the dilemma is they need cash. They actually need money and more money to sustain, first of all, the economy of the regime, not of the country. We all know that there is the Iranian economy, the people, and then there is the integrated economy of the rulers of the actual regime. So they need cash for that. And they use the Iran deal to get that money so that they could survive. This is why when they discreetly talk through our European partners with the US, and they have been doing this for many years, not just under this administration, but previous administration, they say, open the valves so we can breathe economically for the regime. And let's just take our time in the discussions of the issues at hand. What does that mean? That they are ready to negotiate, but their priority is first to get the money. Second, the other part of the dilemma, if they show signs of weakness, then they will open their flanks to a stronger and stronger opposition, which is building. After fall or autumn of 2019 is different than before. The world has seen that there are really tens of millions of Iranians ready to change, and that cannot be reversed. So the Iranian regime does not want to touch their militias. They don't want to even withdraw them. They don't want to stop the development of the missile program. Why? They think, as all authoritarian or totalitarian regimes think, if they open up in one place, it's going to open up everywhere. Look at the perestroika and glasnost. under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. The minute they opened one or two spaces, everything collapsed. So my expectation is they will negotiate about everything, but would not actually implement. And that's the story, that's the history of this regime, even with the Iran nuclear deal.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fares. We have another question. This is from Ray Hanana, Arab News from Chicago. The question is, there have been repeated attacks by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia, attacks in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon, and yet it seems that the US is hesitant to respond forcefully. Does the Biden administration, in your view, have the courage to stand up to Iran's satellite militia terrorism in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and against Hezbollah in Lebanon? Foreign Minister Terzi, perhaps you'd like to respond?
Yes, I have seen. This is, of course, is a major issue and a major question mark, and we see let's say a cautious approach, but up to now, I don't consider it a weak approach by the Biden. We have seen also with the previous administration that the military reaction by the Trump administration to certain crossing of red lines by the Iranians. Yes, there was the elimination of General Soleimani, which was a major event. But there was a limited and careful response to the counterattack that the Iranians, the IRGC, provoked against an American base. So I have seen somehow a similar pattern with the Biden administration when the American base was attacked recently, and there was a reaction by the US. So there is no doubt that this is is an adjustment that can be described in general terms with long-term prediction. Is something which is going on, but there is a willingness by the Biden administration, in my opinion, to deter attacks, especially to deter against American interests, but more in general, to avoid still a scaling up, at least a scaling up of the existing aggressive strategy by proxies of the Iranian regime. Let me add another element here, because we are talking about conventional weapons, and we are talking about military means which are quite easy to deter, but there is an enormous role in all what is happening inside Iran and inside the regime. The role is the role of the intelligence apparatus, the security apparatus, MOIS, IRGC, and other branches of the Iranian organization, in connection to proxies, have you mentioned them, but also in connection to foreign countries. Again, the usual one, North Korea, China, Russia, and some others. So the intelligence activity, it is something which is always there. It is the IRGC, they are moving militarily, but they are moving also on the intelligence level. They have a very strong unit in the cyber warfare. They have a big cyber warfare capacity, and it has increased exponentially over the last 2, 3, 4 years. And another aspect that we have not mentioned, but it has to be considered and looked at very seriously, is the space technology that Iran is acquiring. They are, in fact, they have tested 3 years ago an ICBM with the excuse of putting in low or higher orbit satellites. They are trying with foreign help, and they are helped by the intelligence they're putting around. It is the intelligence apparatus which is connecting countries like North Korea and Iran, and trying to build up this space capacity also for the Iranians, which related to the other issues that we have discussed. It is another element which is threatening our interest.
Thank you very much for that, Foreign Minister. We have another question, Henry Holloway from The Sun in London. The question is, do we have any idea how many missiles will be stored at Kenish, Canyon, or Panch Pelle? Well, of course, it's difficult to say without being on the ground, I guess, for a prolonged period of time. But I guess I would say that obviously, because the missile program is so critical for the regime, and we said it's a strategic lever, I wouldn't be surprised if there were hundreds of missiles at these two sites. And of course, we have to also mention the mobile platforms that the regime has with missiles, and could use them at any possible moment that it deems necessary. There's another question, John Sepin from Washington. It says, if the West, and especially the Biden administration, do not change course with the current regime, and Iran, the current regime, what is the worst case scenario in a year? What should we and the West fear the most? In other words, I guess if I understand from the question is, if the Biden administration and the West continue the policy of, or want to continue the policy of engagement, what holds for the future? What would be the worst case scenario? Dr. Forrest, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I could try a couple thoughts here. Historically speaking, though the Biden administration is technically, practically extending the policy of the Obama administration, the goals. And the goals are to return to the Iran deal, modified, so on and so forth. The Biden administration knows very well what the situation on the ground is. They know the Houthis are firing missiles. They are even stating about it. Everything that panel has covered, the administration with the fantastic apparatus that the United States has, is aware of. Now, there's a difference between being aware of the facts and between what is the plan, what to do about it. And I think that there are two trends in the administration. One trend is to do everything as fast as possible to go back to the minimal agreement, meaning to sit down with the Iranian regime and then go back to the minimum achievement, and then sit down again with the Iran regime, with the Europeans, and with other partners, try to do this other matter. On the other hand, there is this awareness that the Iranian regime is now different, has mutated from 2015. It's stronger, bigger, acquired more weapons, spent, what, $150 billion. All their organizations are much more expanded. So I think the diplomatic teams of the Biden administration, on the one hand, are trying to find ways to message Tehran, calm down. If you want us to do the minimum and come back, you cannot be back and you are firing missiles at the same time. Politically also, it's not a good matter. So within 1 year, all depends on what would the Biden administration prioritize. If it prioritizes going back no matter what, and then we'll discuss the details, then you're going to have one scenario. If the Biden administration may surprise us and say, well, I'm not going back until two at least of these 4 or 5 issues is addressed and reversed. One is stop building the nuclear structure, and 2 is stop deploying at least the missiles outside Iran or in Iran. If it chooses so, then there will be a different scenario. But one condition I see, and quickly here, is that the US this year is different than the US any previous year. We have divisions on this issue. So my recommendation is, before even going back to implement any policy, it will be crucial that the US administration and opposition depoliticize the issue of Iran, come together in a bipartisan manner, the same way they do it on nuclear security, for example, or on Israel or on NATO. We are united. So we need to create a better unity between the administration and the opposition show strength to the Iranians, so that the Iranian regime will understand that they cannot play us anymore one against the other. And then the scenarios will be different at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fares. I guess we don't have any more questions. Just one final thought that I have, in effect, segueing from what Dr. Fares said. There's no question in my mind, and I think many analysts of Iran would also say, that in the final analysis, it is the people in the streets of Iran and the organized opposition who have the final say. And as you discussed and as I explained, the regime is very weak and vulnerable. I think it is at its weakest in its past 42-year history. And despite everything that it has done, the executions, the killings, the arrests, and everything else, I must say that it has been unable to stop growing opposition, growing protest within Iran. We saw after November, we saw the major uprising in Baluchistan. That went on for about 8 days. And also, of course, we saw the past few days on the call by the social network of the MEK, Iranian youth defied the repressive measures that were intended to prevent Iranians from engaging in the Charshambeh Suri fire festival, and engaged in a lot of anti-regime activities over the past couple of days, basically in every major city in Iran. So I think looking ahead a year from now, one would assume that the level of opposition, the organized opposition, will get to a point where hopefully we will all be celebrating in Tehran. I noticed that the Foreign Minister Terzi would also like to say something. Please, Foreign Minister, go ahead.
No, it came to my mind while I was listening to the last question and the answer by Dr. Fares. The news yesterday we got that the Biden administration has warned China about importing 486,000 tons a day of Iranian oil. And Washington has stressed not only the primary sanction, but also secondary sanctions. That is to say, the sanctions against companies, individuals, and so on, which are involved in this trade, are enforced, are being enforced. So whatever is the level of enforcement, but I think that this statement is an important policy statement, because, of course, one has to see what is going to be the prevalence within the administration of these different trends. Those who are in a hurry, those who need more considerate discussion, more understanding of the situation. But I believe it is still important because it has a coherence with what has been said up to now since the beginning, since 20th of January, and even before, by the group, by the Biden's team. And this has not been playing in the hands of the mullahs. On the contrary, because the mullahs, the precondition the mullahs were posing to wipe away all the existing sanctions and sit in order to sit to the table. So I don't want to say wait and see because it is too easy, but I believe that we have to encourage the right element of the administration, as we have to encourage the European governments with all the voices that you can raise, what is the right course of action. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Terzi. I'm glad you raised this point. It goes to show that and as Dr. Fares said, the Biden administration actually, as of now, has not done what it said it would do during the elections. And maybe as a final thought, recall that when the Carter administration took office in the United States back in the 70s, it led to the overthrow of the Shah's regime. And of course, some people say, even the regime officials themselves, that recall that the previous administration was overthrown when Democrats were in power. Who knows, maybe history will repeat itself. And with that, I bring our panel to a close. Thank you very much, Foreign Minister Terzi, for taking the time and joining us, and also Dr. Fares for your illuminating remarks. And I hope that those who joined us have enjoyed this panel discussion. Thank you and have a very good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.